And we'll start with 126. We'll read the first 4 verses of this psalm first. When the Lord turned again the captivity of Zion, we were like them that dream. Then was our mouth filled with laughter, and our tongue with singing. Then said they among the nations, or the heathens, Gentiles, the Lord hath done great things for them. The Lord hath done great things for us, whereof we are glad. Turn again our captivity, O Lord, like the streams of the south, or that is the desert area called the Negev in the south. In your Bibles, many times this word Negev is translated south because to the Israelite it was the same thing. The Negev was south. And sometimes when they were going south, they were going Negev, because that was going in that direction. Or Negev, I suppose, is the right way to pronounce that. In verse 1 it says, when the Lord turned again the captivity of Zion, that is, when the captivity ceased. The situation turned around, in other words, is what it means. It says, and it puts it in the past tense. And then in verse 4, there's the prayer, turn again our captivity. It says, our captivity has been turned, but turn our captivity. And so that's rather strange. Well, let's see why they say that. Let's look at Ezra chapter 2. Ezra is always easy to find because it comes after the first and seconds. You know, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd King, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra. Ezra chapter 2, verse 1. Now these are the children of the province who went up out of the captivity, of those who had been carried away, when Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away unto Babylon, and came again unto Jerusalem and Judah, every one unto his city. So we see in Ezra's time, the captivity was turned again. This is when the remnant came back from the captivities. But now let's look at Joel chapter 3, and you'll see that we're speaking of another time. I don't know how to tell you to find Joel easy. Oh. Comes right after Hosea. Somebody said. Fred said. Joel chapter 3, verse 1. For behold, in those days and in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem. Now, Joel wrote maybe 800 or 900 years before Christ, and Ezra lived maybe about 500 years before Christ. So Ezra's time was still future when Joel wrote. So when Joel says, for behold, in those days and at that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, was he talking about when Ezra would lead certain Israelites back from captivity? No, he wasn't talking about that time. He was talking about a time that's still future to us. And how can we know that? Because, see, he says, in those days and in that time. Now, he's going to tell you what those days were and what that time was. He's going to tell you before he gets to chapter 3, verse 1, and then he's going to tell you afterwards, so that you'll be sure not miss it. So, look in Joel chapter 2, verse 30. And I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, and blood and fire, and pillars of smoke, and the sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. Now, the great and terrible day of the Lord is when Christ conquers the nations of the world at the Battle of Armageddon, when he brings everything to consummation. And it's always preceded by this sun and turn to darkness and moon and so forth. You see that again and again. You have it later in the 3rd chapter, verse 15. And the sun and the moon shall be darkened, and the stars withdraw their shining. Then the Lord shall roar out of Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth shall shake. But the Lord will be the hope of his people, and so forth. So it's that time is when Joel is speaking of. What time? The time, the great and terrible day of the Lord, when that shall come. Look at verse 32 of chapter 2. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be delivered. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be deliverance, and the Lord hath said, and in the remnant whom the Lord shall call. So he's talking about the end times. This is always the language that's used, both in the Old and the New Testament. We're going to show you a New Testament passage that will use this same type of language so that you can know that it always pinpoints, whether you're reading in Isaiah, whether you're reading in Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah, Malachi, or here in Joel, or in Amos, or in the apocalyptic passages in the New Testament, you're going to find that this phenomenon in the heavens always comes at that particular time, at the consummation of the age, just after the Battle of Armageddon. Now here's 2 verses. It'll give you the Battle of Armageddon. First, chapter 3, verse 2. And I will gather all nations and bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will judge, or that is, bring them to judgment, judge them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. You know, it's always been interesting that one of God's complaints against the nations of the world is, they have parted my land. Remember, we said that he calls this my land. That's what he calls the Holy Land. He calls it my land. We've been studying the book of Hosea in Sebring, and we found a place where he called it my land. It's called in Hosea chapter 9, verse 3, they shall not dwell in the Lord's land. And then we went all through the passages and found out all the places where he called it my land. And the classic place, of course, is Leviticus 25:23, where he reminded them that it was his land. And if you want some other scriptures along those lines, it's Jeremiah 2:7, Jeremiah 16:18, and Ezekiel 38:16. In all those places, it's called his land. Not Israel's land, but his land. Do you know this? Does the Bible ever call it the Holy Land? Does the Bible ever call Israel the Holy Land? One time. Anybody know where? Well, it's in Zechariah 2:12, if anybody asks you. That's the only place in the Bible where the land of Israel is called the Holy Land. That's where we get the name, the Holy Land, from. But anyway, it's always interested me that when God is complaining against the nations, he says, they have parted my land. Well, that's what they did. That's what the United Nations did. They parted it right down the middle, didn't they? And God put it back together. Now they want to part it again. Our government says they're not going to have any peace over there until they part the land again. Isn't that what we want them to do as a nation? Yeah, want them to part the land. That's what busted up the peace talks over there this last week or so, is Israel said they're not going to part the land. And they said, well, we want them to part the land. And all the nations of the world, the only nation in all the world today that says the land shouldn't be parted is Israel. And that's God's very complaint. They parted my land, he says. Well, we ought to pay attention to that, hadn't we? if God doesn't like that. Now there's another verse here that lets you know that this is speaking about the Great Tribulation. Look at verse 14 of chapter 3. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. We're in Joel, if I got you sidetracked somewhere else. Joel 3:14, multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near, in the valley of decision, and the moon, sun and the moon shall be dark and its stars. Well, you're going to find that kind of phenomenon that's going to come at that very last day. You'll find it in the New Testament, you'll find it in Matthew, and you'll find it in Revelation. Let's look in Matthew, Matthew chapter 24. Now, Matthew 24 is a calendar. It tells you the progress of time. Verse 15 of Matthew 24 tells you that's in the middle of the tribulation. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand. Then let those who are in Jordan. Now that begins the great tribulation. Why do we say the great tribulation is the last half of the tribulation? Because Jesus is talking, and he says in chapter 24, verse 21, he says, and then shall be great tribulation. When? After the abomination of desolation sits in the holy place. How do we know that happens in the middle of the week? Well, he says, as spoken by the prophet Daniel. And if you went back there and looked in Daniel, here's what you'd find. You'd find that in the midst of the week, after 42 weeks, the Antichrist will put a statue in the holy place, the abomination that makes desolate. And that marks the middle. And that's why we call the last half the Great Tribulation. Because Jesus says, after that happens, then shall be great tribulation, such as there was not, and except those days be shortened, and so forth. Then look at verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days. Now here's the phenomenon that surrounds this. We're in Matthew 24:29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give its light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heaven shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in the heavens, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels, and so forth. So, Joel tells us that the captivity of Jerusalem is going to be returned when the Messiah comes. So, this releasing from captivity under Ezra is just a picture of a later, fuller release that must await the coming of the Messiah. And that's why in our psalm, back to our Psalm 126, Psalm, no doubt, was written after the remnant had come back from captivity. But they knew that the release had not been full, so they speak in the past tense in verse 1, when the Lord turned again the captivity of Zion, we were like them that dreamed a dream, like them that dreamed. Then was our mouth filled with laughter and our tongues with singing. Then said they among the Gentiles, the Lord hath done great things for them. The Lord hath done great things for us, whereof we are glad. Now that's a well-used verse, and it's a good one to use. You know, that's a soul-lifting experience. The Lord hath done great things for us, whereof we are glad. That ought to be one of the easiest verses in the world to memorize, hadn't it? Go around saying that. Well, sit in the wrong places, I guess, wouldn't be too good, but it's good for Christians to say. Then turn again our captivities, O Lord, like the streams of Negeb. You know, in that desert country, there's streams of water. And but first thing you know, they're dry. And the picture here is Israel's been dry for a long time. But every spring the streams came back. And so they said it's going to come back just like that, just like those streams. Verse 5, they that sow in tears shall reap in joy. He that goeth forth and weepeth, bearing precious seed, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. You know, I see Jesus Christ in these two verses. I see him as sowing in tears and reaping in joy. I'll show you what I mean by that. Who knows what is the shortest verse in the Bible? I asked that last week. Huh? Did I ask that last week? Or except a week ago? Well, we found two verses, didn't we? That said Jesus wept. Anybody know where the second one was? The first one was in John, wasn't it? John 11:35, was it? But where was the other one? Huh? Well, it was in Luke, yeah. And he was weeping over Jerusalem, remember? As particularly as he was going to... Well, there's the similar scene is in Matthew, just where we're reading at the end of the 23rd, but it just doesn't say that he wept, but it's the same situation in Matthew chapter 23. I think the other one was in Luke 13. But here he is in Matthew chapter 23, weeping over Jerusalem, just as he's about to go to the cross. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them who are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chicks under her wings, and ye would not. Then let's look in Luke 13. No, this is not Luke 19:41, 42. Luke 19. Thank you, Jim. Yeah, 19:41. And when he came near, he beheld the city and wept over it. Now, what do we mean then he sowed in tears? Well, he said that his crucifixion was like a grain of wheat that was planted. Turn over to John chapter 12. In John chapter 12, verse 23, and Jesus answered them, saying, the hour is come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Verily, verily, I say unto you, except the corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. Well, now he's talking about himself. He's the grain of wheat that had to die, that he would bring forth much fruit. So he sowed with tears, but he's going to reap with joy. Now, if you want to see that put another way, look at in Hebrews chapter 12. In Hebrews 12:2, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. Ye have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin. But Christ did. He could, Paul here in Hebrews could say, you have not yet resisted unto blood. He means you're not dead yet, resisting, or they wouldn't have been reading what he was writing, would they? You and I, we've not resisted unto blood because we're here. And so he could safely say to anybody that read this passage. But it says that Jesus, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross. When he was going to be planted in the ground as a grain of wheat, he saw the joy that would come from that. He could say, no man taketh my life from me. I lay it down of my own will. I have the power to lay it down, and I have the power to take it up again. And that's what he did. He was planted like a grain of wheat in the ground. And then when he came up a whole sheaf. That's us. Did you ever realize that that's why in the Feast of Pentecost they waved the it was in the feast of the first fruits. They waved that stood for his resurrection. They waved the sheaves of wheat, because you see, the grain of wheat had died, and the sheaf had come forth. And when it says, verse 6 in our psalm, he that goeth forth and weepeth, bearing precious seed, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. Now, you see, the seed is precious because when it comes time to plant again, the old harvest is almost gone, and you may desperately need that seed to make bread with, don't you? And but you got to plant it, because if you don't plant it, you won't have a crop next year. And if you'll sacrifice and plant the seed rather than to make bread of it, what will it do? It'll be seed for the sower and bread for the eater, won't it? It'll be both if you let it grow. Well, now, Christ was desperately needed on earth, wasn't he? Look at the ministry he was doing. How terribly this world needed that one that came to bring light. And so it was a very precious seed that was planted. The world, he was crucified when he was in his 30s. The world needed him. There's never been such a need as the need of this world for that human being that was crucified. So it was a precious seed that was planted. But he came again rejoicing, because he foresaw what the planting of the seed would bring forth. And so I see Christ there. Now, of course, by way of application, we're there. We plant the seed and it brings forth. But I believe primarily Christ is that one that was sown in tears, and from which there's a joyful reaping. And he's the one that went forth weeping. And that was he was that precious seed that was sown. And without a doubt, that he has brought his sheaves with him. Sing the song, bringing in the sheaves. So the sheaves are being brought in from the precious seed that was planted. The very dear seed that was planted. Now, why do we plant seed? Those of you that faithfully give to the Lord's work ought to take real pleasure in this. Paul makes an analogy in 2 Corinthians. You know, up at Word of Life, they have all these highly trained men, godly men. There's some terrific Bible teachers. They have the facility up there to to attract the best Bible teachers in the country, like the top men in Dallas Theological Seminary and some of these other places. And very frequently, people see my name on the program if I'm there, and they go up there and they see I'm scheduled to give my testimony or have a seminar on this or speak to the staff kids or something like that. But they wonder why I'm never listed as the Bible teacher. Well, some of the people like, one of the main reasons I tell them, most of their people come from the Northeast, and they put there that Don Kelso was going to be the Bible teacher for a week. They'd have a lot of empty rooms that week, I'll assure you. They got to have somebody to come there that somebody knows who he is, you know. But anyway, it's kind of bugged a couple of the fellows that have me down to South America. And so George Tice invited us down to Recife to teach 2 Bible studies on Christian giving. And we taught 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. So he wrote 2 letters. He wrote a letter to Jack and said that if he didn't have me teach 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 up at Word of Life, the next time he had me up there, he says he needed his head examined or something like that. And and then he wrote the Harshmans that put out our tapes and told them to send the tapes up to Jack on 2 Corinthians. So I got a message from the girl that does his scheduling. I'd already been scheduled to speak there. I'd been scheduled to do 3 seminars on the island for the young people and to give my testimony at the inn and at the campgrounds and 2 or 3 other things like that. So now I've got a message from her that all of that's canceled out, and I'm teaching 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 at the inn and at the campground. So maybe I've arrived. I don't know. But that's just some of these fellows down in South America. They don't know any better, I suppose. But anyway, yeah. Well, I'll decline that. I don't want to be an honorary anything in this world. 2 Corinthians chapter 9. You know, when very frequently, especially in South America, I get introduced as Dr. Kelso, because if they don't know whether you have a doctor's degree or not, they always confer it upon you. They don't want to miss out. And even in this country sometimes at CBMC conventions and so forth, I'm introduced as Dr. Kelso. And I always start out my speech by telling them I appreciate them recognizing my degree, that it was conferred upon me by my mother at the time I was born. My initials are DR. And so that fixes that. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9, it's talking about Christian giving. And this little portion beginning with the 8th verse of chapter 9, and God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that ye always have all sufficiency in all things, that all things may abound to every good work, as it is written, He hath dispersed abroad, He hath given to the poor, His righteousness remaineth forever. Verse 10 is the one we want. Now he that ministers seed to the sower, both ministers bread for your food, and multiply your own seed sown, and increase the fruit of your righteousness. What he's saying is this: when you give to the Lord's work, what you're doing, you're planting a seed. And the seed that you plant will do 2 things. It will give bread to eat and seed to sow. God promises that. Now you see, what he's saying is this: that $10 that you are going to give to spread the gospel, if you used it today, it only would give bread to the eater. But he says that if you put it in God's work, it'll bring seed to the sower and bread to the eater. just like the precious seed that's planted instead of baked. It does both, doesn't it? How privileged is a seed that's chosen to be planted rather than chosen to be eaten. And it seems like you're wasting it. It's put in the ground and rotted. And looks like it does no good. This is the burial of Christ. And this is what our burial should be. We should die to self. We should be dead and buried. The Bible says that we're buried with Christ. We're dead with him on the cross, and we're buried with him. Why? So that we can be not only food to eat, but we can be seed to the sower and bread to the eater. That's the difference between seed that's baked and seed that's sown. I suppose we ought to look just a moment at Romans chapter 6 so we can see that applied to our own lives. See, he says in Romans 6:3, know ye not that as many as of us as were baptized into Jesus Christ were baptized into his death? Therefore we are buried with him by baptism into his death. We're like seed that's planted. For what purpose? That as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. For if we have been planted together in the likeness of his death, here again you see, his death is like planting a seed. And if we will be planted together in the likeness of his death, we shall be also in the likeness of his resurrection, knowing this, that if our old man is crucified with him, and so forth. So he says, if we know that, we'll reckon ourselves to be dead, and we'll be alive unto Christ. If we'll let ourselves be dead and buried, then the seed is sown, and it'll bring forth both seed for the sower and bread for the eater. And that's the difference between seed eaten and seed sown. And Jesus was that seed sown, that precious seed that was sown, desperately needed. And yet he was sown instead of eaten, so to speak. His life was snuffed out that he might be sown rather than his life to be utilized. Why, he could certainly cure the hunger situation of the whole globe, couldn't he? If he could feed 5,000, besides the women and children, with almost nothing. Well, boy, somebody like that could really be a hero in these times. But he was planted, a precious seed planted. And he came again rejoicing. Christ is in all of these Psalms, if we look closely enough. And shame on us for not searching until we found him each time. And we've not always done that, have we? So there's more searching for us to do. But he's here. Sometimes more evident than other times. Well, we can find him real quick in the next psalm. Except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain that build it. Well, he's the house builder. Hold your place there and look back in Hebrews again. My, if you don't learn anything else tonight, you'll learn your Bible sword drill, won't you? Hebrews chapter 3 this time. We'll find him real quick here. In Hebrews 3:5, and Moses verily was faithful in all his house as a servant, for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken after. But Christ as a son over his own house, whose house are we, if we hold fast the confidence. Christ is building a house, is he not? He's building a house. He's the foundation stone, and we're the living stones. I was looking up some of the old information in my family tree back in Scotland. And there was one of them said that all of his lands were taken away because when the Christians, the Covenanters, which were the fundamental Christians of the day, when they were being hunted down by the Catholic king and slaughtered, that he hid them, and he was found to be offering them succor and hiding them. And so his lands were taken away. And I noticed that he had married, it told who his wife was, and her last name was Livingstone. And I thought, because back before that there was no evidence that there had been any hint of Christianity in the family. And I thought maybe he married one of God's living stones, you know. That's how those people got their last names. There was a time when they only had first names, and when they were identified by last names, the Christians generally chose names from the Bible. And I don't think anybody, a Christian, would have known to choose the name Livingstone, except a saved person, would they? And anyway, this particular man back in my ancestry married a Livingston. And so I said, well, maybe that's where Christianity first came into the family, you know. But God is building a house, and Christ is the foundation, and we're the living stones. This also is explained in, besides in 1 Peter, it's also explained in Ephesians chapter 2. So, again, back in our 127th Psalm, except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain that build it. Well, the Lord is building a house, and we're it. And if anybody's building except Him, well, it's in vain. On the way up, Dot and I listened a while to a tape that somebody gave me. They want to know what I thought of the fellow. Well, first thing I tried to decide was he speaking by the Spirit. And I tell that by, is he lifting up the resurrected Christ? And I said, well, I don't need to listen to this guy anymore. He's obviously not speaking by the Spirit. And he was building some sort of a house, I suppose, but the Lord wasn't building it. So whatever he was saying was in vain. But the Lord is building a house. And except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain that build it. And we see a lot of house building. Saturday I had a couple of young fellows from Jehovah's Witness came to the front door. And usually when you have two, these were very young men, and because usually when you have two, you got one that's a learner and one that's experienced. And usually the learner is the one that comes up and starts the conversation because he's being trained, you know. And I've never seen when you could be very successful in converting one of these dyed-in-the-wool ones, because they know enough about the Scriptures that they would have repented and received Christ if their heart had been open to it. But sometimes the learners are open for a word. And so I said, well, now, they had their way. I said, I can see that you're from Jehovah's Witness, and I'm very familiar with the doctrines of Jehovah's Witness, and I appreciate your diligence. Now, I'd like to ask if I could just give you a short word about my own testimony. So I told him how the Lord saved me. And now I said, I'd like to first all three bow our heads, and I want to ask God if He'll do the same thing for you. And the one that was the teacher, he says, oh no, he says, we don't do that. I said, you don't do what? He says, well, we don't ever pray with people like that. And I says, why? And he says, well, you believe in three gods and we believe in one, and we think we shouldn't pray to three gods. We should only pray to one God. And I says, oh, what God do you pray to? He says, well, we pray to Jehovah. I says, great. That's what I want to do. We'll just pray to Jehovah. No, we can't do that. No, we'll leave if you do that. And And they left. They wouldn't pray with me. And so they're building a house, but it's not the Lord that's building it. So they're building it in vain. Except the Lord build the house. So I hope you don't have any trouble seeing Jesus in that verse, right at the beginning of this psalm. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh in vain. Now I got a problem. You're supposed to do 127 and 128 together because they're the same subject, but we don't have but about 7 or 8 minutes left. I spent so much time on 126. So we might have to stop right in the middle. But let's proceed on. Except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh in vain. It's vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he giveth his beloved sleep. What this is saying is, if you stay up night worrying about some danger or peril, that you're eating the bread of sorrow. It's not doing one bit of good. And you're feeding on something that can bring nothing but sorrow to you. For he gives his beloved sleep. I've never taken one of these Sominex pills. I'm not trying to speak against it. I suppose they have their place. I'm just stating the fact I never took one. I see them advertised a lot, you know. But this looks like a pretty good sleeping pill right here to me. It says, he giveth his beloved sleep. Now, I am his beloved because I am accepted in the beloved. It says, he giveth his beloved sleep. That seems like the subject changes, but it's still a good subject. Lo, children are a heritage from the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. Now, actually, some of these words are supplied. In the original, this would be the fruit of the womb rewardeth. It doesn't mean that children are a recompense for something that you do. It means that you'll be rewarded in time and eternity by bringing children into the world. You know, we're going to find in eternity one of the most blessed things that God conferred upon the human race was the ability to propagate both physically and spiritually. And for saved people, God has made it in such a way that you can bear children if you never bear children. Because you can bear spiritual children. And if we had the time, we could point out several passages which bring out that point. Here it's talking about physical children, but it can be applied the same way. The children are a heritage, and the fruit of the womb brings rewards. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so children of one's youth. Now, you know, we just don't believe that. Happy is the man who had his quiver full of them. What about all of this zero growth rate and all that? They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate. I suppose if anybody in the world should be glad for big families, it should be me. If there had never been any big families, I wouldn't be here. My father was the 11th of 11. So if they'd stopped at 10, that would have done me in. And his father was the 8th of 10. So, you know, if 7 had been the perfect number, in either of those cases, that's my father and my father's father. And my mother's lineage comes from a man named Henry Adams, who brought his 8 sons to this country in 1630, when there weren't but 300 people north of Virginia in the whole country, 300 white people. And he brought his wife and 8 sons. Had a little girl after he got here, but he brought his wife and 8 sons, and I'm descended through my mother from the 8th of those 8 sons. And the 7th of those 8 sons fathered 2 presidents of the United States, John Adams and John Quincy Adams. So if they'd have stopped at 7, well, you'd have still had a president, but you wouldn't have had me. So I suppose I ought to be thankful for big families, haven't I? Somebody must have thought that happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. But that's really out of style these days. If you got 2, well, that's a big, big quiver full in these days. Now, all of you grandmas, of course, we'll get into grandmas and grandpas next week, but I suppose we ought to let you know before we go any further that is spoken of. And so that's in Proverbs. This says a song, the title of this song is A Song of Degrees for Solomon. So I don't know just what they had in mind for Solomon, but in Proverbs 17, verse 6, children's children are the crown of old men, and the glory of children are their fathers. Children's children are the crown of old men. Now, I suppose he wrote that. And this would be true for spiritual children, too. Somebody says, the greatest blessing that a person can have is to be saved. Somebody says, no. Greatest blessing a person can have is to be used of God to lead someone else to Christ. Somebody says, no. The greatest blessing you can have is to hear that someone you led to Christ led someone to Christ. So, I suppose even in a spiritual sense, you know, that children's children are the crown of an old Christian. We could say that, couldn't we? So that's a good application. But we'll get into the grandma and grandpa some more in the next psalm. See the last verse? Yea, thou shalt see thy children's children. The Bible has a lot to say about children's children. And I suppose we'll just have to pursue this subject of families. I become more and more excited in ministering to families, and as I see the Bible make such a big emphasis. He's got some sort of an eternal purpose in families. Look at all of these genealogies you see in the Bible. And so maybe those of you that have been interested in your own genealogies or family trees and so forth are not way out in left field. The Bible seems to be interested in that. I sure think that's one reason, and we'll get into that next week, that he's out to attack the family. What all this women's lib is a false mask. It looks like you're staking up for somebody's rights. But what you're really doing is espousing the breakdown of the family. Because you're saying that the thing for a woman to do is to be out doing the same thing that men have done traditionally, instead of doing what the Lord presented in the way of keeping the family. And it certainly doesn't have its roots in the Word. But we'll get into that next week, so if you're an ardent women's liber, maybe you better skip one time and come week after next. Because everything I'll say next week won't fit 100% with the purposes of that particular movement. So you might find one or two small degrees of variance. And so maybe we better pray now. Father, we thank you again for your word, and we thank you that we can find Jesus Christ all through this book. And we thank you for the fact that you permitted us to see him portrayed in some particular way in these two Psalms. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.